biodiversity tends to be on private land in a lot of the West, but because it's low elevation, the valley bottoms that are not developed are almost all private ranches and farms. The valley bottoms that are not big chunks of land owned by one entity are cities, are subdivisions. They're all developed, and that means the biodiversity is pushed out of there. So it really centers private lands as the future for saving biodiversity, not just in the Western United States, but in the world.
Welcome back to the On Land Podcast. Today, we're bringing you a fascinating conversation between Lesli Allison, the CEO of Western Landowners Alliance, and Jesse Barber, a leader in the emerging field of sensory ecology. Jesse was recently appointed Chief Conservation Curator and Chief Conservation Scientist at the American Museum of Natural History. Let's get started.
Well, you also have a fairly unique background starting from childhood in Alaska and then moving to Wyoming as a teen. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I can. So my dad was a wildlife manager. He was a grizzly bear biologist for the Forest Service, and as you and some of your listeners probably know, being in the Forest Service is something like the military, where you move every few years to advance. And so we lived all over the West and most of the time in Alaska growing up. And then when my mom wanted more sunlight, my dad needed to find another job. And at that point, he was into grizzly bears. So we moved to Wyoming, and I graduated high school in Cody.
Well, terrific. That a true Westerner, really, in the deepest ways. Jesse, you are a specialist in the field of sensory ecology, and I have to admit that I had never heard of sensory ecology before I met you, and I was immediately intrigued. And I've mentioned your talk that I had the privilege of listening to in Idaho, out at Lava Lake, to a number of people, and they all have the same response: a sensory ecologist. What is that? So, can you tell us a little bit about what is sensory ecology, and can you give us some examples?
Yeah, I sure can. So, I mean, ecology is the study of connections of life on Earth, and sensory ecology is just a slightly new way of looking at it. That every life form, every animal, let's say, has information that they acquire, and their senses structure what information they have access to, and that has these cascading consequences for how systems are arranged, how they evolve, and how we can save them. So I think one of the reasons that I got into this framing for looking at research in ecology is that I study bats and insects. And bats, of course, use echolocation to orient. They scream out in frequencies above our ability to hear and listen for the returning echoes. And those echoes are the information that they need to live their lives. So let me play you an echolocation attack. Now I've taken it and pulled it down in frequency so that we can hear it. And what you'll hear is a speeding up of pulse rate as the bat closes in on its insect prey, something like a radar screen on an old submarine movie going faster and faster. Here we go. And right there at the end, that's called the buzz, and that's usually a dead insect. And so when you're thinking about bats, you have to imagine a different sensory world, one we don't have access to or don't understand. And the reality of how all other animals hear, how other animals use vision and smell, is they all have their own umwelt, or their own sensory world. And by really focusing on that, we can understand them better. That's what sensory ecology is.
When you were speaking up in Idaho, you were giving some fascinating examples of this invisible world, invisible to us, that's taking place all around us, and the ways in which anthropogenic influences affect that world. So, in other words, the ways in which our noise, and light pollution, and things like that impact these other forms of life is something we're not generally aware of in our world. Can you go a little bit into more detail about what you've studied? I've heard about the Phantom Road study, for example, and some of the light pollution work you've done. If you tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I can. So, I was just talking about bats. And of course, you think about bats hunting insects. It's very basic science. You're just trying to understand life history, natural history. And that early work in my career, that was sort of what I focused on for my PhD, led me into thinking about how the sensory environment affects wildlife. And so one of the first projects I launched after I did my postdoc at Colorado State, and in combination with the National Park Service, was this Phantom Road project. And that was playing back recorded traffic noise at a very large scale and studying migratory birds. And so the basic idea was to try and experimentally and incisively test if noise was a driver of of some of the negative effects we know that exist from roads and other types of human infrastructure. So you think about a road, so let's say you find out that there's fewer birds around the road. Most people probably aren't going to be surprised, but why are there fewer birds around the road? Are they getting hit by the cars? Is the road an easy place for predators to move along? Is there chemical pollution that's washing off the road that's somehow impacting their nests? There's a lot of possibilities, and one of those is noise. And the primary reason that I suspected that noise was a major problem is because the effects we were seeing were at distances far enough away from the road that it seemed unlikely that these other factors were driving it. So to experimentally test that, we strapped a bunch of speakers to trees up in the foothills outside of Boise, and we played back traffic noise. And we tried to do it as authentically as possible, in that the playbacks were timed to move from speaker to speaker, so that went down the line. Here, I'll play a recording of it. We played it back at about 55 decibels, which is really not that loud. Most offices are about that loud. Most neighborhoods in our country are about that loud. And these were cars going 45 miles an hour that we recorded. And we made the recordings in Glacier National Park, and then created this playback file. And the one of the sort of little stories I can tell about how effective it was is, more than once we had hikers and hunters approach our study area thinking they were walking to the highway. And in fact, they were walking the wrong way. And we'd point them back towards the road. But the punchline from this work, we played this road noise back for 2 years to migrating songbirds. And the only job of a migrating songbird is to pack on body fat, to go further on the journey, and to not get eaten. And what we found is that about 30% of the birds avoided the noise altogether. And those that stayed in the noise exposed area failed to gain weight.
Wow.
So they were not able to pack on that body fat, meaning that noise is indeed a source of habitat degradation.
Wow, that's remarkable. And I remember one of the things you highlighted in your talk up in Idaho, which by the way was a wonderful talk. It was out on for our listeners, it was out on a beautiful private ranch up in Idaho. And the context was perfect, because you could sit out there, and in the very distance you could hear the highway, and you could see this open land, and you could see the insects flying around us. It was a wonderful context for thinking about this. You also mentioned an urban situation about what happened with birds in urban areas, and then what happened during COVID.
Yeah, so this is a really awesome story that came out of long-term basic ecological research. So this group has been studying white-crowned sparrows in the Bay Area for a long time, for multiple generations of researchers, in fact, and studying their songs and really basic questions about mating and song production. And what they found is that during COVID, when the world got substantially quieter, these birds started singing songs that had never been recorded in the Bay Area before. And so they were not singing the most optimal song for the quiet conditions, because there were no quiet conditions. And when they arrived, thanks to the pandemic, they deployed those songs. that type of acoustic response likely happened all over the planet, but this was a one place where it was studied very well.
It was just remarkable to me, and it made me think about a time recently. I was up in a national forest area in a place I've spent a lot of time in my life, and it's always been very remote and wild and extremely quiet. You could hear a lot of birds and insects there, and I was sitting kind of on a ridge listening to some bird song, and then across the canyon up came a whole line of ATVs. And not only were there the engine sounds of the ATVs, but they actually had a boombox on one of the front ATVs. It was just blasting song music across the canyon. And it to the point where all the way across this entire drainage, I couldn't hear anything but the noise that was being generated from this lineup of ATVs. And I thought to myself, wow, I can't hear the birds. And then I thought, I'll bet the birds can't hear the birds. And I
Yeah.
wonder what kind of a problem that is. And as we're seeing more and more studies coming about the impacts of recreation, for example, displacing wildlife for up to half a mile on either side. And we're really getting more and more into the backcountry with more people and more noise in the form of various types of machines and equipment. So what I'm seeing in my mind, and you've referenced this with the density of roads in the country, is we have this mushrooming density, both roads and trail systems. What does that do to wildlife in the larger picture here, to insects and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, clearly there are negative impacts. And the thing about studying impacts from human use of the land is that it's always going to be nuanced. There's always going to be species that do fine. And those urban survivors we see around us all the time. And when you see, starlings in huge numbers, you see a red fox run through your neighborhood at night, you think, oh, well, we are building a world of coexistence. But when you step back and look at all of biodiversity, all of life on the planet, a lot of it they need conditions that are we don't create in our built world. And trails and roads are probably the most dominant source of human infrastructure on the planet. So for instance, we know that the United States Forest Service manages more miles of road than any entity on earth, any other country, because of the extensive amount of logging roads that we put in place. And then those logging roads tend to get used by ATVs and other types of transportation by humans. And we've known for a long time that trails drive wildlife away. I mean, there's not a single hunter listening to this right now that doesn't know that you get off the road to be successful in your hunt. And even if you're on a busy trail that lots of other hunters are using, that's not where you want to be. You want to hike to that hidden valley that only you and your friend group know about. And the reason those are such effective hunting grounds is because there aren't very many people there. So we just completed an experiment that got published this year where we took the same sort of experimental approach that I talked about with the Phantom Road, but we played back recreationist sounds. So we recorded people hiking and mountain biking and a person on an ATV and played those back to wildlife. And this was in collaboration with the United States Forest Service Research Station with Kathy Zeller and Mark Dittmer. And this was done in the Bridger Teton National Forest, south of Grand Teton in Wyoming. And we had these transects of camera traps where an animal would be moving along a game trail. The first camera trap would trigger speakers to play sounds about 20 meters away. And then there was a series of other camera traps to capture their behavior. Did they move down the trail? Did they run away? Were they vigilant, looking around for predators, or did they seem to not change behavior? And the sounds we played back varied in group size and thus also in sound level. And these categories I talked about: hiking, mountain biking, and an ATV. And the basic punchline is that we found that animals ran away. They did so for up to a week after a limited exposure, and there was about a 2 times lower abundance of wildlife along those trails during these playbacks. They were 5 times more likely to flee, 4 times more likely to be vigilant. And group size mattered. The bigger the group, the more avoidance behavior we saw. And although we only tested one ATV, it had a similar impact to these different group sizes of people on non-motorized recreation. So in sum, I think what it shows is that the same thing we've known forever, that people drive wildlife away. But the new addition is that it's the sounds of people can have an impact at distances much greater away than the actual trail. So from a management standpoint, you can start to think about buffering trails and thinking about that trail impact as extending away from the trail for a good amount, as far away as you can hear it. So if you could hear that ATV playing music on the other side of the canyon, that's probably the distance that the wildlife are running away.
Wow, that is so insightful. The idea of putting buffers around trails in the planning process or around roads in the planning process and making sure that we've got those spaces in between where wildlife have some point of refuge, some place to go, and that it's big enough to sustain that because and that addresses a concern. I've done some just my own mapping of different trail systems as they overlap around my community and beyond, and it's amazing the web of trails that we're creating, and there seems to be a lot of emphasis on more and more and more trail building and more people outdoors, and of course, I think we all support the idea of people being out in nature. We understand the beneficial effects it has on us and on kids, so we want people in nature, and so that's one management step that perhaps outdoor rec departments, trail builder groups could do is to put those buffers in there. What are some other things we could do? Are there times of day where maybe we want to try to obviously we want to try to be quieter when we're in the field? Are there times of day or seasons?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, the crepuscular periods, dusk and dawn, are some of the most important times for wildlife. And again, that's why people hunt at the beginning and end of the day, knowing that's when animals are going to be moving. It's also when a lot of animals vocalize because their calls carry much further in those acoustic conditions than they do at midday. So those periods are the most important biologically. And if you did limit exposure during those periods, you would undoubtedly have ecological relief. Now, in the end, it often comes down to education and regulation. And as we know, federal agencies have not, they have very little funding to do these kinds of things. So you could put a temporary closure on a trail system, but who's going to enforce it? Are there really people going to be following that? So it comes down to really building trails, I think, and making sure that you're not putting more trails in and that you're thinking about it critically at the planning stage. And I think we talked about this in Idaho, that this is really where private lands form this incredibly protective buffer for wildlife, that there can be a gigantic ranch that is in charge of whether or not people are allowed to move on it and how they access it. And wildlife figure that out, right? That's why we're always begging our friends that own these big ranches to please let me elk hunt there, because I know all the elk are going to move onto your property away from the national forest. And wildlife are pretty damn smart, and they can figure these things out quickly. So I do think you can try and do more detailed management, but we need more money. We need the federal government to support conservation.
Right. Well, what you're saying as well about the private lands, it reminds me of something a friend of mine once said to me. She said, Leslie, before I knew you and the work that Western Landowners Alliance does and the work that's happening on these ranches, she said, I had the idea that most of the wildlife was on public lands. Because that's where I go hiking and that's where I would see wildlife. And I assumed that's where most of it was, and that it wasn't on private lands because we just don't know about what's going on there, and often we hear negative things in the press about that. And but what we've said over and over, it certainly has been my experience in my life with private lands and the ranch I managed and the many ranches I've been on, is that's actually well managed private lands. ranches around the West, that's where you find the great abundance of wildlife. And it's not just elk and elk season. It's like going on a wildlife safari on a lot of these places. You cross that public-private boundary, go into the private land, and suddenly you're seeing a whole different world. And so they really do provide this refuge for wildlife. And I think what's fascinating to think about is that it's not just a refuge for the deer and the elk and the pronghorn and the bears and the lions and all that. It's actually our insects and our birds are also finding refuge there because of this noise impact. And I guess the other thing that comes up in my mind I'd like to ask you about is the light element, because these are also places where you have, so much less lighting. How does light affect the movement of wildlife and these other species?
Yeah, we know a lot less about light than we do noise. The noise pollution literature in studying wildlife is only roughly 20 years old. Light pollution is maybe only a decade old. Then these are in terms of really intensive studies, multiple labs all around the world focusing on these questions. But we already have some pretty good data that light changes animal movement. So a lot of the light pollution work that I do is focused in US national parks and doing experiments and changing out lighting in parks to try and see what's best for insects and bats ecologically, but still providing the needs of people. And the basic punchline there is that the lighting that we're using now is not working in that it's shifted to these really bright, very blue LED fixtures that are as bad as it can get for wildlife. But if you move back to where we were, these older amber fixtures, but of course you do it with LEDs for modern low energy, climate friendly solutions. But if you lower the intensity, put the light right where you need it, make the color warmer towards an amber, you basically can return the habitat to almost darkness like ecological functioning. But right now, with these really bright pieces of infrastructure all around the world, we get insects attracted to the lights. Bats shift their space use patterns to take advantage of those insects at the lights. A whole other group of bats are averse to lights because they fly slow and are afraid of predators, and they avoid the lights. And there are also similar impacts on small mammals. And we are starting to study larger animals to see what's going on. But in general, it is altering the way that wildlife move. And so that's why the national park system has taken this as one of their avenues they're going to approach with the infrastructure bill, is to try and put friendly lighting in all these places.
Wow, that's really interesting. So, Jesse, you've spoken about the urgent conservation need. And there's an urgent need to implement conservation, and you mentioned a few minutes ago the need for further investment by Congress. Can you go into that a little bit further and help us understand how you see the linkages between moths and bats and this bigger picture of life on Earth and human well-being?
Yeah, yeah. I've got a few thoughts. One is protected lands, national parks, wilderness with a capital W, is that they're amazing things for somebody that values biodiversity, that values human experience in nature. But one of the major problems is they're patchy. They're here and there all over the landscape, and they're not connected, and they're mountaintops. And we know, and you talked about this earlier, is that biodiversity tends to be on private land in a lot of the West, but because it's low elevation, the valley bottoms that are not developed are almost all private ranches and farms. The valley bottoms that are not big chunks of land owned by one entity are cities, are subdivisions. They're all developed, and that means the biodiversity is pushed out of there. So it really centers private lands as the future for saving biodiversity, not just in the Western United States, but in the world. So how do you connect, a group of ecologically minded private landholders and these, you know, national parks on the tops of mountains. So really trying to provide funding mechanisms that are going to allow that fabric to be connected so that as climate changes where animals need to live, they can move and flourish is the frontier of conservation. And it's not really something that we talk about a lot. That's one major thought I have about what the future is. And the second one is kind of related to what we were talking about with trails, that getting people to realize that nature is restorative, is to their own psychology, that it is a experience that they want to have, that they want their children to have, is something that we need to focus more on too. Because as the world becomes more urbanized, people have less experience being in nature. And those, those two things are apparently in opposition, right? Because we're right now in one side, I'm saying people on trails are driving wildlife away, and we need to make sure that we manage people on trails. And then the other side, I'm saying that we need to get people out in nature so that they want to save it. Well, where it comes together is thinking about how do we minimize our impact and maximize coexistence and getting people on the landscape. So that means really smart management. We're making trails sister roads that are designed to be quieter so that all of the impacts can be localized, leaving land for wildlife.
It's absolutely fascinating. About 100 different questions and ideas come to mind um, almost immediately. I'm curious though, how has your interaction been with the landowners you've worked with and done studies on their land? Where are they? What's their interest level in this?
Yeah, it's been really high and amazing. Like I actually have never had a sit down conversation at a kitchen table with a family and not had them say, "Yes, Jesse, you can work on my land." Everybody has said yes. And I found that really amazing because the federal research lands, that doesn't always happen. It's not always a solid yes. And the ranch I've worked on for the last decade plus is Lava Lake Lamb and Livestock in Idaho, one of the largest ranches in Idaho. They hold easements from the Snake River all the way through Craters of the Moon to the top of the Sawtooth. So it's this incredibly vast landscape that we've done different studies on in several different pieces of their land. And Brian and Kathleen Bean, who own that ranch, their desires have always been to support science and to understand their land. They want to know what's there. And I think that's something that biologists can provide to private landowners.
Absolutely. It's interesting. I think our membership, by and large, is very much in alignment with that. I think that's why they're part of the Western Landowners Alliance, is because they care about these things. One of the fundamental challenges, probably the top challenge that we face, is helping these places remain economically viable. They not only are supporting all of these wildlife species as we've just been describing, they're also supporting human economies, food systems. They're putting the food on our table and the clothes on our body and the shelters over our heads. They're so fundamentally important. And yet they're struggling so much economically. And I continue to find one after another of some of these very leading conservation-oriented ranches, not just the conservation ones to full-on production, but they're failing. They're faltering. They're economically not making it. The next generation, doesn't want to inherit, endless work and endless debt to stay on these places, and that makes succession a challenge, and it makes management a challenge. So finding some economic support to keep these places intact, and perhaps that starts partly with being able to value and compensate for the many services that these lands provide, not just what's produced in terms of food and fiber, but what's supported in terms of ecological values, like providing these refugias for wildlife. So that's a big hope we have, is that we'll be able to call attention to the critical role these places play and the critical need to be able to better support them, both in terms of science, but also in terms of economics.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm 100% behind that. I mean, the idea of biodiversity credits is something that has been discussed primarily in thinking about the developing world. and how do we deal with some of these global challenges? But clearly those same challenges are right here at home.
Absolutely. So another question that popped into my mind as you were talking about some of these things is knowing that we want to be outdoors, knowing that probably most people, if their awareness was called to it, would want to to be better about not impacting wildlife to the extent that we are. And I'm wondering if some of the new technology, some of the apps like a Merlin app or some of the other ones that detect these insects and birds and so forth could be helpful in calling all our awareness to what's around us. And I was using my little Merlin app the other day, and I had to make everybody in the party shush for a little bit to listen to the birds around us. And everybody got quiet and really listened. And you could suddenly see, oh, there were all these birds surrounding us that we had been oblivious to in all of our conversations. So in a way, it calls our attention not just to the wildlife around us, but to our own noise in the environment. What are you seeing in terms of those apps? Is there one that's coming out that'll help us see even more into the natural world?
Yeah, so there's a lot in development in a lot of different entities. Cornell is who produces the Merlin app, and they actually also have a research grade outfit that is BirdNet, and that one we use it in our research, and so do a lot of folks right now. And you can feed in long-term recordings and get really good output on all of the songbirds that are in North America. They're also the bioacoustics program at Cornell is trying to expand that to all vocalizing wildlife. And that means that you could start to understand all kinds of different things, birds, bats, insects. And really that's one of the fundamental limitations of this idea of biodiversity credits, of understanding what people have on their lands and compensating them for it, is how do you rapidly assess that biodiversity? And I feel like talking about AI on a podcast is probably happening everywhere right now. And here we are. But I really do think that these AI models, this machine learning for long-term acoustic recordings, is the answer to rapidly assess this biodiversity.
Yeah, I would actually agree with you, and I find myself surprised to say that, but I'm actually excited by the potential here of the AI and the new technology to help inform us and help inform our impacts on the world. And I know we have, gosh, most of the ranchers I've talked to have already got, some kind of listening going on. They've got bird monitoring stations going on. They've got their Merlin apps or whatever else. And people are actually pretty excited. They love learning about these things. So I think this is a very promising new direction, actually, when it comes to the AI stuff. And of course, the human piece is always going to be necessary in the mix to inform those models and decide what we want to do with them. What further research do you think is needed? Are there particular areas of research you are excited about?
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of stuff I'm excited about, and most of it is involving sensory pollution and thinking more about how noise and light are impacting wildlife. And I'm really interested in mitigations. Like I want to implement and test ways of making the world quieter and darker and understanding what it does, because we've been in the world of noise and light pollution. We've been focused on understanding impacts, and I'm not as interested in documenting the sinking Titanic as I am in trying to make it not sink. So I think we need to figure out how can we try and improve coexistence. And there isn't a lot of experimental quieting, experimental darkening research. And that's what I think the frontier is.
Ah, that is just absolutely fascinating. And is that where you'll be focused? What's your upcoming focus, and how does it tie in with the American Museum of Natural History?
Yeah, so the American Museum of Natural History is one of the great repositories of animal history on the planet. It's one of the largest natural history museums. That's in terms of the number of collections. And it has a whole entire staff of scientists that focus on understanding the natural history and the evolutionary history of all these different groups. And what they're pushing into now is conservation, is how do we start to think about saving all of these different groups of wildlife. And so one of the first things I'm going to do is try and make an archive of soundscapes. There is no global repository with the backing of a major entity like the American Museum to try and save these long-term recordings. Because every time we put out a microphone and record for a few days, a few weeks, you get a snapshot of the world that will never be there again. It's a history of the planet, and wrapped up in that recording is how was that land managed. But if you just have a recording of one place, let's say someone's ranch, and you're starting to see a decline in the songbirds on that ranch. Well, songbirds are declining across the entire continent. So, and world likely. So how do we put that in context? And the only way to put biodiversity in context is to have a picture of it as many places as we can. Because it's likely that if that landowner is doing a good job on their ranch, they're slowing the decline. But a slow decline still looks like a decline if you don't have the appropriate control.
Yes, absolutely. And I think finding ways to work with private landowners to collect that data in ways that are protective of the landowner interests while still making that information available to science and to the land managers on the ground is, to me, one of the most interesting and promising things ahead. What would you hope that listeners would take away from your research, from what you're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, I guess like one take home is every animal on the planet sees the world differently than we do. And we can't use the way we look at the world to predict what they are going to care about and how they're going to be impacted. So we have to be open to the idea of different experiences. And really that translates to the way we look at the human world too. Understanding that all of us have different lives and see the world slightly differently is a wonderful thing. And it lets us solve problems in a more holistic way that are more robust, more resilient. And that if we work together and factor in the way a lot of different perspectives, we will find the right answer.
Well, thank you, Jesse. And thank you for this tremendous body of cutting edge research that is just so critically important to sustaining life on Earth, to supporting human well-being and our ecosystems and so much of what we care about. It's phenomenal. It's exciting, actually. I'm looking forward to what comes next in the field and in your career, and really appreciate all that you've done and taking the time to be with us here on the show today.
Thanks for having me. It was fun.
Thanks to Jesse Barber for joining us for this conversation. Learn more about Jesse's fascinating research at the link in our show notes. And thank you to Lesli Allison for hosting today's episode, which was produced by me, Zach Altman. Thanks, and we'll see you next time on the On Land Podcast.